There's a moment in life when something quietly shifts. It doesn't announce itself. There's no warning, no dramatic breakdown. It's just a realization that hits you in the middle of a normal day. You are living your life like someone is watching you, even when no one is. And the strange part is, you're not even sure when it started. Somewhere along the way, approval became a currency. Opinions became a scoreboard. And the fear of judgment started making decisions for you. Not loudly, not obviously, but subtly, consistently in the background of everything: what you wear, what you say, what you post, what you don't say, even the version of yourself you allow to exist in certain rooms. And if you're honest, it starts to feel like you're not fully living your life anymore. You're managing it. Now here's the truth most people never hear in a way that actually lands. Most of the people you're trying to impress are not thinking about you. They're thinking about themselves, their problems, their insecurities, their next moment, their own image. And that realization should do something powerful inside you. It should free you, because the weight you've been carrying was never as solid as it felt. Let's get something straight. Caring what people think is not the problem. The problem is when it controls your behavior, when it decides your boundaries, when it edits your personality, when it silences your instincts. That's when you stop being authentic and start being adaptive. And the more adaptive you become, the more disconnected you feel from yourself. So how do you stop caring? You don't turn it off. That's not how the mind works. You rewire the priority system. Right now, your brain is doing something simple but powerful. It is treating social approval like survival. But here's the shift: your life does not improve when more people approve of you. Your life improves when you approve of your own behavior, even when nobody else does. That's the reset point. Because the strongest people in any room are not the ones who are universally liked. They are the ones who are internally aligned. They know what they stand for. They know what they won't bend on. And they understand something most people avoid: disapproval is not danger. It's information. Sometimes it means you're wrong. Sometimes it means you're early. And sometimes it just means you stopped fitting into someone else's expectations. Now here's where it gets real. Every time you act out of fear of judgment, you reinforce a pattern. Your brain learns, other people are in control of my behavior. But every time you act in alignment with your values, even when it's uncomfortable, you teach your system something new: I am safe when I choose myself. That is how confidence is built. Not through affirmation, but through evidence. So the goal is not to stop caring overnight. The goal is to make other people's opinions secondary data, not irrelevant, just not decisive. Because once you reach that point, something changes. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop editing your personality in real time. You stop living like you're on trial. And you start doing something far more powerful. You start moving through life as the cause of your actions, not the reaction to other people's reactions. And that's where freedom actually begins. Not when everyone approves of you, but when you no longer need them to. An empath doesn't leave suddenly. That's the first thing people misunderstand. There is no dramatic exit, no loud confrontation, no emotional explosion that signals the end. What actually happens is much quieter, and by the time you notice it, the decision has already been made long ago. It starts with tolerance, not because they enjoy discomfort, but because they are built to understand. They read intention more than action. They look at context more than behavior. So when someone hurts them, dismisses them, or emotionally disregards them, their first instinct is not to retaliate. It's to interpret. To ask internally, what's going on with this person that makes them act like this? That reflex alone keeps them in situations most people would exit immediately. But every system has a threshold. At first, the violations are small: a comment that lands slightly wrong, a moment where their feelings are brushed aside, a pattern of being interrupted, minimized, or emotionally overlooked. Individually, none of these moments are enough to trigger an exit response. In fact, the empath often rationalizes them away. They assume misunderstanding before malice, stress before disrespect, insecurity before intention. And that interpretation keeps the relationship alive far longer than it should remain intact. But here's what people don't see. Every ignored feeling is not forgotten. It is stored, not as anger, but as data. Quiet emotional data. A record that builds slowly in the background. And the empath, while forgiving on the surface, is internally tracking something very precise: emotional reciprocity. Are they safe here? Are they respected here? Are they emotionally seen here? And the moment the answer starts becoming consistently no, something subtle begins to change. They don't argue more. They argue less. They don't express more. They express less. They don't try harder. They start conserving energy. Because empathy, when it is not met with safety, doesn't become louder. It becomes quieter. It begins to fold inward. What looks like patience from the outside is actually emotional evaluation in progress. Then comes the turning point, and it's rarely noticed in real time. It doesn't look like a fight. It doesn't look like rejection. It looks like indifference forming where care used to exist. That is the real signal. Not anger, not sadness, indifference. Because anger still means investment. Sadness still means attachment. But indifference means the emotional system has started detaching from relevance. At this stage, the empath is still physically present, still responding, still engaging. But internally, they are no longer trying to fix anything. The effort shifts from repair to observation. They begin to see patterns more clearly without emotional distortion, and what they usually see is repetition. The same behavior cycles, the same emotional neglect, the same imbalance. And once the system recognizes repetition, it starts predicting outcomes. That prediction removes hope, and without hope, attachment weakens rapidly. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They assume silence is forgiveness. They assume calmness means stability. They assume things are getting better because the empath is no longer reacting emotionally. But what is actually happening is far more final than a reaction. The empath is no longer trying to be understood. They are simply deciding how much longer they need to remain present before leaving feels clean. Because they do not leave in chaos. They leave in clarity. And clarity always arrives after emotional exhaustion. After repeated invalidation has removed the need to explain further. After enough moments of being misunderstood that explaining feels pointless rather than productive. When that threshold is crossed, the empath stops negotiating emotional reality. They stop translating their feelings into simpler versions for others to accept. They stop adjusting themselves to maintain connection. And once that adaptation stops, the relationship doesn't immediately end, but it stops growing. It stops breathing. To the outside observer, nothing dramatic has happened. But internally, the separation has already occurred. The emotional bond has already loosened. The presence becomes physical only, no longer psychological. And that is why their departure feels sudden to others. Because people are measuring the moment of exit, not the long internal process that made the exit inevitable. By the time they actually disappear, they are not leaving because of one final action. They are leaving because of accumulation. Because emotional safety was not a consistent experience. Because their internal boundary system finally concluded that staying requires more self-abandonment than leaving requires discomfort. And when an empath reaches that conclusion, they don't announce it. They don't negotiate it. They don't revisit it. They simply step out of the dynamic in a way that preserves what they have left of themselves. Quietly, completely, and often without return. An empath doesn't burn out in a single moment. It's not dramatic. It doesn't look like collapse or emotional breakdown right away. It looks like endurance. It looks like patience. It looks like someone who keeps showing up, keeps understanding, keeps explaining, keeps absorbing what others refuse to process. And that is exactly where the problem begins. Because what most people see as emotional strength is actually emotional overextension. At first, an empath enters relationships with a very high tolerance for imbalance. They are wired to decode people rather than reject them. So when someone is inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, or even self-centered, the empath doesn't immediately label it as a threat. They interpret it as complexity. And that interpretation keeps them engaged far longer than is healthy. They try to bridge gaps that were never meant to be bridged alone. They try to stabilize emotional dynamics that require mutual effort, but are only receiving one-sided input. And in doing so, they slowly begin to normalize effort without return. This is where the exhaustion begins, but it's so subtle that it doesn't register as danger. It registers as responsibility. The empath starts to believe, if I can just explain it better, they'll understand. Or, if I can just stay calm enough, they'll meet me halfway. Or, if I can just be patient a little longer, things will shift. And each of these internal narratives keeps them inside the dynamic long after the dynamic has stopped being reciprocal. But emotional energy is not infinite, even for people who seem endlessly understanding. There is a cost being paid every time they regulate not only their own emotions, but the emotions of others in the interaction. Every time they absorb tension instead of expressing it. Every time they translate chaos into calm so the situation doesn't escalate. Every time they stay composed while internally processing discomfort that never gets addressed. That cost accumulates. And the accumulation is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as subtle changes first. Slight delays in response, less enthusiasm in conversations, shorter explanations, fewer emotional bids for connection. Not because they care less, but because their system is reallocating energy toward preservation instead of expansion. This is the beginning of emotional conservation mode. At this stage, the empath is still present, still engaging, still showing up. But something fundamental has shifted. They are no longer investing emotional energy freely. They are spending it strategically. They are subconsciously asking, is this worth what it costs me internally? In every interaction. And when the answer becomes uncertain too often, engagement begins to shrink. This is where the paradox appears. From the outside, they still look like the same person, still kind, still understanding, still available. But internally, they are slowly reducing access, not to punish anyone, not to create distance intentionally, but because their system is trying to prevent depletion. And here's what makes this stage dangerous for the relationship dynamic. The other person often doesn't notice the withdrawal, because empaths are skilled at maintaining surface level stability even while internal investment is declining. They don't abruptly disconnect. They gradually reduce emotional output. So the environment feels normal, even as something essential is being removed from it. Meanwhile, the empath is experiencing something very different internally. They are carrying emotional fatigue that doesn't resolve with rest. Because this isn't physical tiredness. It's the exhaustion of continuous emotional processing without resolution. It's the strain of being the regulator in systems that never regulate themselves. And when that continues long enough, something critical happens. Effort starts, they still try, still explain, still support, still absorb. But over time, they begin to notice a pattern that effort alone does not change outcomes. The same misunderstandings repeat, the same emotional imbalance persists, the same lack of reciprocity continues. And once the nervous system recognizes repetition without resolution, it begins to conserve energy more aggressively. This is where emotional burnout becomes inevitable. Not because they stop caring, but because caring no longer produces change. And when caring stops producing change, the brain starts categorizing it as wasteful expenditure. So the empath begins to disengage not emotionally at first, but behaviorally. Less explanation, less emotional labor, less initiation, less repair attempts. They stop trying to fix what keeps returning to broken. And this is where people around them often misinterpret the shift. They assume distance means indifference. They assume reduced effort means loss of interest. But in reality, it is self-preservation taking over. The empath is not leaving emotionally yet. They are simply stopping the internal bleed that comes from constantly overextending without recovery. Eventually, though, even this conservative mode becomes unsustainable because there is still interaction happening, still exposure to imbalance, still moments that require emotional output. And without reciprocal replenishment, even minimal output becomes too expensive. That is when withdrawal begins to feel natural. Not because they want to leave, but because staying requires more internal compromise than they are willing to continue paying. At that point, even small interactions feel heavy. Even simple conversations feel like effort without return. Even presence feels draining rather than connecting. And once that threshold is crossed, the empath doesn't argue for balance anymore. They don't request change in the same way. They don't keep trying to educate or explain emotional needs. They simply begin to step back internally while still physically present for a short time. And what most people don't realize is that by the time they notice the empath is pulling away, the empath has already been gone in terms of emotional investment for a while. What remains is only courtesy, only habit, only residual presence. And that is why when the final departure happens, it doesn't come as a reaction. It comes as completion. Because the burnout didn't happen at the end. It happened slowly, through repeated emotional overuse that was never matched, never corrected, and never balanced. So the exit is not sudden. It only looks sudden to the people who never saw the gradual depletion happening in real time. Silence is almost always misunderstood. People tend to interpret silence as uncertainty, as avoidance, as emotional confusion. They assume when someone stops reacting, stops explaining, stops engaging the way they used to, it means they are still processing something externally, still deciding, still in the middle of an emotional equation. But with an empath, silence is rarely a question. It is an answer that has already been decided internally. Because what looks like silence on the outside is often the final stage of intense internal processing that no one else was invited to witness. Long before the outward stillness appears, there has already been a deep shift inside, a transition from emotional participation to emotional observation, from trying to fix the dynamic to simply mapping it, from engagement to assessment. And once an empath moves into that internal state, everything changes. They stop reacting in real time and start responding from conclusion. They are no longer discovering how they feel in the moment. They already know. The emotional uncertainty that once created dialogue, questions, explanations, and attempts to repair has already resolved internally. What remains is not confusion. It is clarity. And clarity is what produces silence. Because once something becomes clear, there is no longer a need to keep revisiting it. At first, the silence is subtle. It doesn't look like disconnection. It looks like restraint, fewer words, shorter responses. Less emotional expansion in conversations that used to carry depth. Not because the capacity is gone, but because the motivation to extend energy into environments that do not reflect it has been reduced. But this is not the beginning of withdrawal. It is the midpoint of decision. The empath has already begun to categorize the interaction differently. What once was seen as a space for connection is now seen as a space for evaluation. And once that shift happens, expression changes. Not abruptly, but precisely. They no longer speak to be understood. They speak only when necessary. They no longer explain to bridge gaps. They observe whether gaps remain even after explanation has already been given in the past. And this is where most people miss the signal entirely. They think they're just quiet right now. They think they're just tired. They think they'll open up again later. But what they don't realize is that silence, for an empath, is not empty. It is full. Full of conclusions. Full of internal resolution. Full of emotional data that has already been processed without external input. Because empathic processing doesn't require confrontation to complete. It doesn't require arguments to finalize understanding. It only requires enough patterns to become undeniable. Once those patterns are recognized, the empath stops trying to change them through expression. They stop trying to influence outcomes through communication, and instead, they begin to observe without participation. That is where silence becomes permanent in behavior, even if the person is still physically present. And here is the most important part most people never understand. Silence is not withdrawal first. Silence is protection. When an empath feels that continued expression leads to distortion, misunderstanding, or emotional exhaustion, they begin to reduce output. Not as punishment, but as conservation. Because every attempt to communicate something meaningful into an environment that does not receive it correctly creates internal friction. And over time, that friction becomes more costly than the silence itself. So they begin to simplify their presence. Less explanation, less emotional translation, less correction of how they are perceived. Because at a certain point, correcting perception becomes more draining than accepting misinterpretation. And once that threshold is crossed, silence becomes the most efficient form of self-preservation. But what makes this silence powerful is not just reduction of words. It is the removal of emotional accessibility. They are no longer internally available in the same way. Even if they respond, even if they engage, there is a distance that cannot be bridged through additional conversation. Because the internal connection that once fueled engagement has already started to detach. And this is where the illusion of everything is fine becomes dangerous. On the surface, nothing appears broken. The interaction still exists, the replies still come, the presence is still there. But the emotional layer that once gave depth to that interaction is no longer active. It has been turned inward, redirected away from external dynamics and toward internal stability. And the longer this continues, the more irreversible it becomes. Because silence, once it reaches this stage, is not a pause. It is a transition into non-participation. The empath is no longer investing emotional energy into maintaining relational equilibrium. They are no longer adjusting themselves in real time to preserve connection. They are simply present without attachment to outcome. And when outcome no longer matters, interaction loses its leverage. That is when people usually realize too late that something has changed. They try to re-engage. They ask more questions. They demand more clarity. They attempt to pull words out of someone who has already reduced emotional output to the minimum required for presence. But silence at that stage is not responsive to pressure. It does not expand under demand. If anything, pressure tightens it further. Because every attempt to force expression confirms what the empath already concluded internally, that expression in this environment is not safe, not effective, or not meaningful. And so the silence deepens, not because of stubbornness, not because of resentment, but because the internal system has already completed its evaluation and moved on from negotiation. At that point, silence is no longer something that needs to be broken. It is something that exists because breaking it no longer serves a purpose. And that is why, when empaths finally disappear after this stage, it does not feel like an argument that ended. It feels like a presence that was slowly removed long before anyone noticed it was being removed at all. And if you've been listening closely, you'll notice something important. None of this happens in a single moment. There is no dramatic turning point where everything changes at once. It's a sequence. A slow internal shift that most people never see while it's happening. That's why silence feels so sudden when it finally arrives, because people are reacting to the end without ever noticing the process. But here's the part that should stay with you. Silence is never random. Not with someone who feels deeply, processes deeply, and thinks in patterns instead of reactions. When they go quiet, it is not because they ran out of words. It is because words stopped producing results. When they pull back, it is not because they stopped caring. It is because caring stopped being received correctly. And when they finally disappear, it is not an emotional reaction in the moment. It is the final expression of something they already understood a long time ago. So the real question was never, why did they leave? The real question is, what did the silence already say before they did?